And so this guy Jairus comes and throws himself at the feet of Jesus, and he begs Jesus. Listen to what he says in Mark 5:23. He said he pleaded with him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. My little girl is dying." And I highlighted in my text that word, little girl. Can you hear the desperation in the voice of a daddy here? Mark doesn't include this detail, but Dr. Luke, the great historian, does. In his gospel account, he lets us know that this was his only child, his only little girl. She was 12 years old. And we don't know what her illness was, but she was at the point of death. She was at the moment of death when Jairus comes and throws himself at the feet of Jesus and pleads with him to help her. We have 5 kids, 5 children. 1 in heaven, and 5 here. And we have, we've had a blast over the last, Lauren's 22 years old, so over the last 22 years. And I'm glad I had a little girl first. I got one girl and 4 boys, and I'm glad I had the girl first because she really softened me up for the boys. I can't imagine how difficult it would have been for those guys had I not had a little girl first to really soften my heart. I was thinking, as I've been contemplating this text, early on, you know how parents are in the early days, especially your first baby, right? I was that dad. I was the dad. Tracy still gives me a hard time about it. I would wake Lauren up at midnight just to goo and gaw and play with her. I was a really bad dad in that way. And just trying to bubble wrap her and comfort her. Tracy would have her in the bath, and I would actually go put the towel in the dryer and get it warm, ready for her to get out of the bath, right? Yeah. Now, Trevor had to change his own diapers, but Lauren, she got the heated towel treatment, right? Those of you who are parents, can you remember the first time your firstborn was really, really sick? Like the first time they got really ill. She was just a baby, just a few months old, and she got one of those really bad fevers. And I remember us having her in the bath trying to bring down. We were at the point of having to take her to the ER, right? We were in conversations with the on-call folks at the doctor's office. When do we take her? And I recall, this is just burned in my mind, that she was so sick, so weak that when we took her out of the bath trying to cool her down, she was just limp, and her eyes were almost hollow, just from a fever. But she was pitiful. But Daddy was even worse. I mean, I just felt powerless and helpless. You know, the Tylenol wasn't working, the bath wasn't working, and I didn't think she was going to die, but I didn't think she wasn't not going to die. You know, I mean, I was so pitiful. I cannot imagine the point of desperation that this dad was in. Because, you know, as we grew and we had more kids, and I think that's great. I think the more kids you have, just the more resilient your kids become, because you really do. You know, they have to learn to fight really early and survive, and you know, and all of that stuff. So we are not helicopter parents by any stretch of the means, right? But in those early days with that first baby, Jairus only had one little girl. It was his only baby. And she's at the point of death, and he is a desperate daddy. And he comes and he says, "My little girl, my little girl." I mean, Mark is so intentional to use the words of this father, as we can feel the fear and the desperation that he has while his only child, his little baby girl, is at the point of death. And he begs Jesus, "Come, please put your hands on her that she'll be healed and live." And the Bible doesn't say that Jesus said anything. We have no indicators that he used any words. He doesn't speak. He just acts. He goes with him. And that's where we saw last week the interruption of this woman who refused to stay in her lane, in her audacity and in her boldness and in her refusal to obey the norms and the rules. She reaches out and touches Jesus. And instead of Jesus turning and scorning this woman and saying to her, "How dare you, unclean woman, touch a rabbi?" Instead of her telling her that she should, have kept in her, norms and by keeping the standards of what was appropriate and lawful. And he doesn't say that to her. What he says is, daughter, your faith has healed you. And so we see that, and we marvel at it, and we celebrate it, and we say how wonderful. If you're Jairus at that moment, what are you feeling? What are you feeling when that happens, that interruption happens, and as Jesus is saying the words, daughter, your faith has healed you, and Jairus is sitting here saying, what about my daughter? Weren't we going to see her? And at that moment, while Jesus is still saying those words to that woman, this is what happens in verse 35. It says, while Jesus was still speaking, some people from the house of Jairus comes and says to him, your daughter is dead. I can't imagine hearing those words. I just can't. And I pray that I never hear those words. Some of you have had tremendous losses like this. I just can't, I don't think that there could be a more difficult loss than the loss of a child. Right? That's not how that's supposed to happen. They're supposed to bury us. We're not supposed to bury them. And Jairus hears the dreaded words at this moment, your daughter is dead. So don't bother the teacher anymore. Let the rabbi alone. And look at what verse 36, it says, overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. Or literally, keep on believing. I told the earlier service this morning, I don't know why it didn't come to me as I was reading and preparing this week for this, but it happened right here on the stage, as it generally does. I think God just likes to have fun with me, and you know I am the poster child for attention deficit disorder, right? You know that's me, right? And so when I read that text this morning, Steve Perry's voice came into my mind for the first time, don't stop believing, right? Just keep on, that love and feeling. But that's what Jesus is literally saying to this guy. Don't be afraid. How? Don't be afraid? What do you mean don't be afraid? How can I not be afraid? I've just heard the worst words I could ever hear in all of my life. Don't be afraid, but keep on believing. Literally, keep believing. Just believe. And so verse 37, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. That's his inner circle there. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and he said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, just asleep. But they laughed at him. So what we need to do for a few moments is we need to get into a time capsule, right? Or a wormhole, and we need to transport ourselves back to the first century 2,000 years ago, because you and I can't appreciate or understand exactly what's going on here unless we understand the historical and cultural context, because context is... That's right. And so what's happening here? Well, in the first century Jewish world, there were professional mourners. And so when someone died, professional mourners would come. They would be hired, and they would come, and they would show outward expressions of grief and sorrow. They would tear their clothes. They would wail very loudly. Now, you can imagine if that was true for the typical everyday Joe Schmo, then how much more true would that have been for someone like Jairus, a respected synagogue leader? So they came out in droves. They all wanted to be part of this event. So they come to Jairus' home, and when Jesus shows up with Jairus in his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, the scene is chaotic. It is a circus. It is obnoxiously loud, with these paid professional actors making this great commotion, wailing, tearing their clothes, making all of this loud commotion. And then Jesus stops the show, the ShowStopper. He stops the show and he says, why all this commotion? The child's not dead. She's just asleep. And what happens? They start laughing. Now, you blinked and missed this as you've read this before. But you do not go from wailing and crying and weeping when you're grieving to instantly laughing. Not if you mean it. So what we see in the text here is not an act of people who are sharing in the grief of a daddy and a mama who've just lost their baby. What we're seeing is a show. An outward, chaotic commotion of just play acting. And we see it because on a dime they turn from this loud commotion of wailing to laughing because they think this guy just cracked a joke. And so watch Jesus. It says, after he put them all out. Who's the them? The mourners. The professional mourners, the actors. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went into where the child was. Goes into the little girl's room where she's laying lifeless. And he took her by the hand and he said to her, now look at this. Isn't this interesting? He says to her, and these words are in italics, Talitha cum. Talitha cum. And Mark is helpful here because he tells us, which means translated, little girl, get up. Wake up. Why? Why does Mark do this? Why? Because none of us know Aramaic, right? None of us speak Aramaic. Why would he even, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, because this was the mother tongue, this was the heart language of Jesus. You may think that first century Jews spoke Hebrew. Most of them did not. Hebrew was the scholastic language. So where you would speak or hear Hebrew would be in the synagogues. But in everyday language, no, it was Aramaic. So Jesus' mother tongue and the mother tongue of his disciples as Jewish people there would have been Aramaic. Not that they would not have known some Hebrew and recognized Hebrew, but they would not speak Hebrew. Kind of like traditional Catholics would know a little Latin if they, went to traditional masses, but that's not the language they would understand or that they would speak. So they spoke. This is their mother tongue. Also, being residents there of Galilee, I told you last week that was a commerce center, and so people from all over the world were there. Gentiles from all over had settled in that land, and so they would have also spoken Koine Greek, common Greek, which was the language that Alexander the Great had spread all over the known world a couple of centuries before in his conquest. So they would have been multilingual, but this was his home, his heart language. This was his mother tongue. It was the language that he shared with this father and this mother and this little girl. Why does Mark use that? Why does he not just translate like he does the rest of the whole conversation? Why does he include the heart language, the very words, the actual sounds that came out of the mouth of Jesus when he speaks life back into this little girl? Would you like to know? I would too. I'm going to ask Mark about that one day when I see him. I do have to say an educated guess is probably a little much, but I have a sanctified imagination here. I just think there's something very special that what we're seeing here, what Mark is inviting, what the Holy Spirit is doing here, and letting us hear the very sounds of this. I think what he's showing us is the intimacy of what's happening here. Contrasted to the distant, show that was being put on by the people who really weren't emotionally invested in what was happening here. They weren't sharing in Jesus is there. And I think just hearing the very words and sounds that came out of his mouth when he leaned over the lifeless body of this little girl and he saw the tears wailing up and running down the faces of Mama and Daddy Jairus there. And he just leans over to her, takes her hand, and he says, Talitha cum. Little girl, get up. I don't know, when I hear that, when I see that, I'm somehow reminded of how I hear the voice of God in my heart. I don't hear him with a British accent. Right? Doesn't sound like Charlton Heston to me. It's just when God speaks to me by His Spirit in my soul through His Word, when He speaks to me, I hear His voice, and there's just such familiarity to it. There's such closeness and such intimacy. I think some of us have this distant, almost deism idea of God. Like He's the clock, maker, winds it up and lets it go. That's deism, this impersonal, almost, force out there. And that's not Christ at all. That's not how Christ interacts. That's not what Christ calls us to. God did not send His Son to this planet that you and I might have a religion. Jesus came to this world that you and I might have a relationship with the living God, with Jesus Christ Himself. And in that there is intimacy. In that there is closeness. How personal this thing is with God. How the gospel is not something that's just out there. I mean, it's right here. God knows me. He knows me, knows everything, every freckle on my body, every hair on my head, which is not that big of a deal anymore. Freckles maybe, but that God knows me, and that intimacy and that closeness. And I kind of think sometimes we lose sight of that, and we get so distracted, and we get and sometimes it takes a moment of us being in a place of helplessness and hopelessness, and where we've got nothing or no one, any hope whatsoever, that we find ourselves again in the presence of Jesus. We find His faithfulness, His concern, His love, His care for us, and we are overwhelmed again that His presence is real. And this isn't something that's out there. This isn't something that's distant and impersonal. That Christ is here. Do you know He's here this moment? I mean, whether you have worshiped Him this morning or not, whether you are encountering, whether you can sense in your spirit right now the presence of the Holy Spirit, can I tell you, and I know this, and I sense this, I feel this, I'm certain of this, that Jesus Christ, the Sea Walker, the ShowStopper, is in this room, in this moment. And can I tell you that you are not an anonymous number to Him? He has brought you here this morning intentionally to meet with you wherever you are, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, whatever you're facing. Can I tell you that the voice that said into the darkness, "Light be," is here right now, calling your name. Just sit in that for a moment. Just sit in that for a moment and realize that with all your stuff, with all the baggage that you brought into this building, your scars, your skeletons, with all of that, the King of the cosmos stands in front of you today, arms wide open, calling you by name. Come further up, further in. Come and see. The mourners didn't get to see that. The mourners didn't get to see the miracle. They were play acting. But Mama and Daddy and Peter and James and John got to see something that day that no one else got to see. He took her by the hand and said, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, wake up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at this, they were completely astonished. Who's the they? Jairus and his wife, Peter and James. And do you understand that no one had ever seen anything like this before? I mean, they had already seen a leper healed. They had seen a blind man restored his sight. They had seen just moments before a woman who had suffered from a bleeding disorder for 12 years, the same age of this little girl. For the same length of time that this little girl had been alive, this other woman had suffered with this disease. They had seen that. They watched a man who was out of his mind, possessed with, darkness and evil, restored to sanity and given his life back. They had watched Jesus stand on the bow of a fishing boat and say to the waves and wind, "Lay down, be quiet." And they were astonished. They have had their socks blown off already, but they have never seen this. In fact, what you can take from when we go back up here and hear this, when the folks from Jairus' house come to Jesus as he's still talking to the woman, and they said to him, "Listen, the woman's dead, or your daughter's dead, so why bother the teacher anymore?" Do you know what the subliminal message in that is? He's just a teacher, and yeah, maybe a miracle worker, but his power stops at the doors of death. Nothing else can be done. Yahoo for the sick that have been made well. Glory for those who have been healed. But no one can heal death. This is too much, even for this guy from Nazareth. No one can heal. No one has seen this. And even though his disciples had already witnessed with their very own eyes some things that they could not explain, some things that absolutely dropped their jaws to the ground, they were still astonished when they saw a dead girl brought back to life. And listen, she was dead. When you go back to it, Jesus says, right, "Why are you doing this? She's not dead, she's asleep." So you're sitting here wondering, what's going on? Is Jesus having an integrity outage here? Is he playing fast and loose with the truth? Is he lying? The girl was dead. Dr. Luke tells us in Luke 8:55, when he's describing what happens when Jesus says these words to her, "My child, get up," verse 55 of chapter 8, Luke says, "Her spirit returned." So if you were thinking she was only in a coma at this point, no, she was dead. So what was Jesus saying when he said she's not dead, she's just taking a nap? Was he being dishonest? No. See, Jesus is the only one who's able to call something that isn't as if it is. That's what the scriptures say, right? Jesus is the only one to recognize and to declare that what you're experiencing is temporary. It's like a nap. She's going to wake up. And so Jesus knows that the girl's heart has stopped. We're talking asystole, straight line, beep, she's gone. Her spirit has departed. But Jesus also knows she's about to get up. She's about to wake up. This is just a nap. Now listen to me. I don't know if you faced this yet. Some of you in this room, I know you have. We've walked with you through it. But you're going to. And the sooner that you come to this place of faith and understanding in your life, the much better for you. When you come to realize that your death is imminent. The scriptures tell us, Lord, teach us to number our days. That means that we need to live in the reality of our own mortality. We have a very limited time on this planet, and some of us are wasting it. And so when we live in the light of death, understanding that there's going to come a time where we don't have time anymore to do what we've been placed on this planet to do, that brings some seriousness. There's not a one of you in here that if you were to get a diagnosis this week that says, "Hey, 6 months and that's it," there's not a one of you who wouldn't change the way that you're spending your time and your energies and your focus. Am I right? Well, I'm calling you to come to this place that none of us know. None of us know. And the sooner we get to a place when we live in the reality of our own death, the better. Because as William Wallace says, every man dies, but not every man really lives. Am I right? But to take that a step further, the sooner you and I come to realize that our death is not really death, it's just a nap. Oh, the boldness. I mean, the fearlessness. I mean, the audacity and the purposefulness that will breed in our lives when we recognize that when we breathe our last, it's just a pause because it's not the last. And that when we put that loved one in the ground, that you and I have a hope, and I don't mean hope like wishful thinking, I mean hope and a certainty of anticipating. Man, that changes the game, doesn't it? That changes the equation. How many of us are living in light of our own mortality and also living in the fearlessness of knowing that not even death has power greater than the sea walker? Some of us are afraid to speak up because we're afraid of the backlash we might get, or someone might not like us, or we don't want to do something that's uncomfortable because we're afraid of loss. Or what? I'm telling you, when we get this in our hearts and we believe that Jesus raises the dead, it's a game changer. And it is a showstopper. It really, really is. And so watch this as we get ready to bring this thing in for a landing and bring some application to what we can do with this. It says in verse 42, immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. So this was I mean, like instant, right? Instant transformation. She's lying there lifeless. Her spirit has left her body. Jesus speaks to her in her own language, and he tells her to wake up, and she instantly gets up and she walks around. And Mark wants to, again, remind us that she's 12 years old, so she didn't need any assistance in doing that. And at this, they were completely astonished. And verse 43 says, he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. Or again, still at this point, Jesus is doing things on his own terms. He is not interested, track with this for a moment, he is not interested in drawing a crowd and building his fan base. That's not what his interest is. His interest is not in trying to collect more likes and shares at this moment. What his interest is to do the work of the Father and the work of the kingdom and for light to break into the darkness. And this is a very intimate, personal, and private experience that we don't get the sharing until after the fact when it reaches the gospel records. And so the mourners didn't get to see it. The crowds that were pressing in didn't get to see it. Even the rest of the disciples didn't get to see it. And he gave strict orders to the parents. Don't go around publicizing this. Not yet. It's not time yet. It's not time yet. But this is what I love. And I'll try not to go off on a tangent, but I can't promise that I won't. And then he told her to give her something to eat. I love that. I love that. Were you here a couple of weeks ago when I just kept telling you, I kept beating it into your brain that you are a body and a soul and a spirit? Remember that? Body, soul, and spirit. Body, soul, and spirit. I love that Jesus just raised a girl from the dead and he says, she's probably hungry. She needs some calories. I love that. I'll tell you why I love that. I love that because at least the way I read this, what it says to me, or one of the things it says to me, is that Jesus is not just concerned about the big things in my life, about like getting me saved and forgiven and all the massive crises that I face. I love that Jesus cares that I need to eat my breakfast. He's concerned that I've got bills to pay. He's concerned about the little things in my life every day that someone else might take for granted. That Jesus is all in, and He is all sufficiently able and more than enough for everything that I have. And so if God wanted to, I wouldn't have to work. He could just do with my refrigerator what He did for the widow. Right? Just never run dry. I could go in there and never have to go to Walmart again, right? I mean, just every time I open it up, wow, fresh milk, right? Fresh food. I would never have to worry about going to work. But God knows that though He could miraculously provide all those needs, He's chosen through very ordinary means of everyday life for me to do things. So when I got up this morning, or when I get up tomorrow, and I tie my shoes to go to my consulting gig, or if I'm doing one of the other 1,000 things that I'm doing, whatever I'm doing, I know that I can't get up and tie my shoes and work and make a living to take care of my massive tribe at home without these little bitty things, these practical, everyday, simple things being possible. And I can't even tie my shoe without the grace of God. And my job is a gift from God. And my ability to move and walk and the talents and the knowledge that He's given, the skills and all these things may seem very insignificant. They may seem practically, just not very spiritual. But God says you need to eat. And He's concerned about that. I love that. Man, if I'm going around raising the dead, I'm like, see that? I'm out. Drop the mic, I'm out. Jesus said, hey, don't forget to eat. Can I say that to you today too? Yes, pray. Yes, pray. Seek the Lord. Seek the kingdom first and foremost. All these other things will be, yes, do that. But can I tell you that you also need to get off your batucuses and move them? And I'll tell you why. I will tell you why. The creator of the cosmos who made you, wonderfully, fearfully made, has just made some things the way they are. Body, soul, and spirit. I read it again today. Hard data, research. I do this for fun because I am a nerd. But I saw another study come out this week where the data is. Do you know, track with me here for a moment, don't get lost, but do you know that there is a super drug that works more effectively for especially depression and anxiety than any medications that we have known? I mean, a super drug. And I'm telling you, data, study after study after study shows us this. That another study came out this week that shows us that this thing is more effective than SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, in treating and helping people deal with depression. This super drug. Do you want to know what this super drug is? It's exercise. It's exercise. I mean, we have the data upon data upon data that if you don't move your body the way God designed it to move, and if you eat Dunkin' Donuts all the time, you're going to get depressed. And you're going to have anxiety. And so, I mean, it may be fun getting there, right? But I mean, so I'm telling you that I love that Jesus, I've offended Bethany. I'm sorry, Bethany. No, I'm just kidding. I just mortified Bethany. I'm telling you that Jesus is concerned that you eat a vegetable every once in a while. And that you get out of the bed or get off the chair, that you turn off the Netflix, that you get some oxygen going through the extremities of your body and into your mind brain, because the single most effective thing for brain health is exercise. And that's even more important as we get older. And the powers this has to stave off dementia it's because God made the brain. God made the body. God made the spirit. And I love the one that speaks to the spirit and says, get back in here. Also says to the rest of them, give that body something to eat. Now, I'm not going off on this today. I'm really, maybe a little bit. But my big point is I'm just crazy astonished at how concerned Jesus is about every tiny aspect of my life. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. You know, Mom and Dad, you probably need to eat too. I bet you haven't had anything in a while. You've been sick with concern. I bet you're pretty weak too. You probably need to get some food in you as well. I just love Jesus. I'm just crazy about the fact that he is crazy about us as his people, his prized people, his special, called out, known before the foundation of the world, chosen in him, known by him, loved by him. Yes, with all of our crud and our junk and our scars and our baggage and our skeletons. Yes, he is. You think that he doesn't know what's going on with you? Man, he knows you better than you know yourself. And I'm telling you, he brought you here today to be reminded that he loves you. So some things I want you to take away. Some things I want you to take away today. Number one is that when all hope is lost, we are not without help. When all hope is lost, we are not without help. We may feel that we have come to the edge of the road and there's nothing else that can be done and we cannot do anything else. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's the place. Maybe that's exactly where we need to get. So we can stop white-knuckling and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and finally throw ourselves at the feet of Jesus and trust in him. But I am telling you that when all hope is gone, we are not without help. I could just rattle off right now. You could too, many of you, just dozens of scriptures about the Lord as our helper. We're not without help. Maybe you're at the end of your abilities. Great. Maybe you're facing an impossible mountain. Great. Mountains, waves, winds, demons, diseases, not even death is a match for Jesus. So you remember that when you get to the place of hopelessness, that there is help beyond your own abilities or the abilities of anyone else. The second thing is this, is that when we are paralyzed by fear, that is an invitation to faith. Oh, there's some junk out there today that's telling you that come to Jesus and man, everything's going to be awesome. You'll never get sick, not if you believe good, and you'll be rich, and he'll give you all the desires and dreams, and no matter how narcissistic or idolatrous they may be. I mean, Jesus is your genie in the Bible. You rub him the right way, he'll give you exactly what you want. There's people teaching. That's selling very well today. I'm going to tell you that if you're going to follow Jesus, there's a cross involved, and there's going to be times that you are going to come at places where you are absolutely paralyzed, and that you will face fear. This daddy faced fear. I mean, there was a fear like no other. But I love what Jesus said to him. Don't be afraid. Just keep on believing. And I'm really trying to keep Steve Perry out of my mind right now, but just keep on believing. Keep on believing. So when we're paralyzed with fear, we're invited to faith. And here's the last one, right? And I'm going to let you go because I'm hungry. These two services, give the man something to eat, right? All right? To see the impossible, you have to believe the incredible. To see the impossible, you have to believe the incredible. I don't know exactly why Peter, James, and John were invited in on this, but it's not the first and last time, or it's not the only time. There's a couple of other times where they got to see some things that no one else got to see. They only get to read about them like me and you. I mean, they're up on the mountain, right? And suddenly Moses and Elijah show up out of nowhere. And Jesus is like, and they don't even have language. He metamorphosized right in front of them. We don't even know what that was like. We don't even know. But Peter, James, and John saw it, and they couldn't describe it. They're just like, we don't want to leave. Let's build a tabernacle right here, and let's stay right here, right now for the rest of the time. They got to see some things. These mourners, they didn't get to go in. The crowd wasn't invited to this. This was a very small group of people. But I'm going to tell you that in order for us to see the impossible in our lives, in our marriage, right? Or with our kids that we are begging God to do miracles in their hearts. Or in this faith family, in this community. If we want to see God do the impossible, we have to believe the incredible. We have to believe. We have to believe. Or we will not see what God is able to do. So I encourage you this morning, in an age where deconstruction is the norm and people are looking for all kinds of reasons not to believe and to doubt, excuses to stay disengaged, arguments to not fall at the feet of Jesus, I just encourage you, if you want to see the impossible, you have to believe the incredible. Jesus has demonstrated his supremacy over the forces of nature, the spirit world, diseases, and now death itself. How many of you are familiar with The Lord of the Rings? Watched the movies, read the books? Some of you are not. Come on, you can admit it, right? My favorite one is the third in the trilogy, the Return of the King. For a lot of, that's a cool name, by the way. I mean, it's cool. I did a series one time on the Return of Jesus called Return of the King. Totally ripped it off. There's this scene in the Return of the King where Gandalf is back from the dead, as it were, and Sam, who has been through hell and back, whose heart has been wrong and has been against loss and loneliness and difficulty and just indescribable pain. Sam sees Gandalf, who he thought was dead. And this is what Sam says. By the way, you know Tolkien was a Christian. He was one of the best friends of C.S. Lewis. He's part of that Inklings group that used to meet there in the pub there in Oxford. So Tolkien has a lot of Christian imagery and allegories that he writes into this. But so Sam sees Gandalf, and this is what Sam says. He says, "Gandalf, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself." Is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happening to the world? I love that. Is everything sad going to come untrue? I don't know what you're facing or what you might be facing. You don't even know is around the corner. I know right now, as we mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of hurt, a lot of sadness. Can I tell you that according to the return of the King, that there is coming a day, sooner now than it ever has been, where everything sad will come untrue. Jairus saw that. He got a prequel that morning. He saw it with his very eyes. Him and his wife, they saw the sad come untrue. And can I tell you, those of you who belong to Jesus Christ, here's the promise. And this is why we need to fix our gaze on him, see him and savor him and not look away. Because there's coming a time that everything sad will come untrue. And you and I need to walk out of these doors today, not dismissed, but sent into a world of sadness that needs to know that one day everything sad will come untrue. Because Jesus, in his very powerful and personal voice, will bring to a righteous conclusion the end of this dark day and these shadows. And he will make everything sad untrue. You can count on it. Just keep believing.